The final months of the Pacific War were not merely a clash of armies or fleets. They were the unraveling of an entire empire and the rise of a new form of warfare that would shape the modern world. In those fading days of the conflict, as entire cities burned and oceans trembled beneath the weight of steel, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface, something invisible, unheard, unseen, yet powerful enough to fracture the backbone of an empire that once believed it could dominate half the world. It was a war fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with invisible signals, deciphered messages, desperate pilots, relentless machines, and the kind of courage that emerges only when survival itself becomes a question of hours. Before the world heard of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, before Tokyo lay in ashes, before the emperor spoke words no Japanese ruler had ever spoken, another battle was raging in quiet rooms, filled with humming radios and crackling wires. American code breakers, unknown, uncelebrated, unseen, were peeling back the secrets of the Japanese empire like layers of an ancient manuscript. Every intercepted signal became a whisper of the enemy's intentions. Every broken code another step toward victory. And while these silent warriors worked in darkness, far across the ocean, young American sailors stared at the sky, searching for the glint of wings that carried not bombs, but men willing to die. The Kamikaze were coming, unstoppable, unbreakable, driven by fanaticism, honor, desperation, and an empire's final breath. They fell upon the Pacific like shards of molten metal, like the last scream of a dying beast. They were not a tactic. They were a final prayer from a nation cornered by inevitability, and facing them stood machines, guided by radar screens glowing like moons in the night. Technology had become a shield, an eye, a voice in the dark, warning the fleet before death struck from the clouds. This is the story of how the Pacific was won, not by chance, not by numbers alone, but by a triumvirate of forces: the silent precision of code breaking, the terrifying fury of kamikaze assault, and the unwavering courage that arises when men realize the fate of the world may rest in their hands. This is the story of how victory was carved out of fear, fire, and signals drifting across the ocean. The final months of the Pacific War felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. Across the ocean, millions waited for the moment when the empire that had once shouted its ambition from Asia's mountaintops would finally fold under the weight of its own desperation. But those who lived within the storm knew that the war was no simple contest of ships and aircraft. It had transformed into something deeper, more invisible, and infinitely more terrifying. The horizon no longer carried the shape of battleships alone. It carried the unseen threads of intercepted messages, the soft glow of secret radios, the quiet hum of machines listening to the sky, and the resolve of men who understood that survival meant grasping the enemy's intent before the enemy acted. As the Japanese Empire tightened its final fist, it sent toward the sea young men who no longer expected to return, men who believed their death might delay defeat for just one more day. Against them stood the quiet watchers of code and radar, men whose names would remain forgotten even as their work shaped the course of history. It was a collision of the visible and the invisible, of shrines and steel, of faith and mathematics, of desperation and determination. And when these forces met in the vast blue wilderness of the Pacific, the result was a kind of warfare the world had never seen before. Those spring of 1945, the Pacific had become a vast machine of motion. Every island, every stretch of ocean, every cloud carried meaning. For the American sailors who rose at dawn and watched the sun ignite the horizon, each new day felt as though the sky itself held secrets. They knew the enemy was listening. They knew the enemy was watching. They knew the enemy was preparing a storm that no one had ever experienced. Yet what the Japanese pilots did not know was that their movements no longer belonged to them. Their flights, their launch times, the headings whispered across their radios, the coded messages that guided their formations, all of it drifted silently into the hands of unseen analysts sitting thousands of miles away. In a small building on the island of Oahu, the air was heavy with heat and tension. Papers lay scattered across the desks, covered in strings of numbers and fragments of broken signals. A young lieutenant with tired eyes leaned over a table, tracing patterns within the intercepted sequences. Each line meant something: a movement, a destination, a hint of strategy. These rooms rarely heard cheers. They rarely heard shouts. They heard only the clicking of typing machines, the soft rustling of paper, and the occasional breath released one another. Fragment of the Japanese code, cracked open to reveal the truth. Those men never saw the battleships they saved. They never saw the sailors who survived because of the warnings they sent. They never saw the smoke that rose from the oceans when their predictions allowed a fleet to strike first. But the ocean felt their presence in every battle. The Japanese pilots did not know their empires. Secrets had escaped into the world long before their planes ever rose into the sky. They trained with precision, believing their missions were hidden by unbreakable codes, unaware their messages were translated before they even reached their own commanders. When they climbed into their cockpits, fastening the straps across their uniforms, they believed they were part of a sacred final effort that would force the Americans back. They did not know that as soon as their engines roared to life, someone far across the sea whispered their location into the ears of men preparing to defend themselves. Hulls of carriers that moved with deliberate calm across the water. Above them, antennas rose like metallic spires reaching toward the clouds. Each rotation of the radar dishes painted an invisible picture across the sky, showing what the human eye could not see. Somewhere over the horizon, engines growled. Somewhere beyond the clouds, wings cut through the air. The radar saw all of it. It sent warnings down the corridors of steel, where sailors rushed to their stations, tightening their grips on the guns that lined the decks. They knew the enemy was coming, though they could not see them yet. They knew the sky would soon erupt with flame. Inside the Japanese airfields, the atmosphere was entirely different. The wind carried the scent of fuel and dust. Mechanics checked the wings of aircraft built not to return. Pilots wrote their final letters, some steady and composed, others trembling with the weight of words they would never speak aloud. They climbed into their planes knowing they carried not only explosives, but the final hopes of a nation running out of time. When they lifted off, the ground fell away beneath them, and the world became a vast canvas of blue and white. They did not realize the signal announcing their departure had already been caught, decoded, understood. They flew believing they carried the power of surprise, but surprise had died long before they reached the sea. As they approached the American fleet, the first sign they saw was the distant flash of sunlight on metal. What they could not see was the invisible field of anticipation surrounding those ships. Men stood ready at their guns. The radar officers tracked every movement in the sky. In the operations rooms, commanders watched glowing screens where small blips crawled across the grid. Those blips were not simply aircraft. They were the shapes of men who had already chosen death. There was something haunting in the knowledge that each dot carried a heart still beating, a mind still aware, a story still unfolding. And yet there was no room for hesitation. The sky belonged to whoever acted first. The first kamikaze dives began like whispers before escalating into screams. A plane plunged from the clouds, its engine howling, the pilot guiding it with unwavering intention. The sailors below felt time stretch into something unreal. The gun crews fired bursts of metal into the sky, turning the air into a storm of shrapnel. Some planes burst into flame before reaching the ships. Others, trailing smoke, still pushed forward with terrifying resolve, as if the pilots were fighting not the guns but fate itself. When a kamikaze struck the deck of a ship, the explosion felt like a thunderclap tearing through the sea. Fire erupted, men were thrown from their feet. But the fleet did not stop. Damaged crews ran through smoke-filled corridors, sealing off compartments, dragging the wounded to safety, choking on fumes as they extinguished the flames. Every ship struck was a reminder that the enemy no longer feared death. But death alone could not overturn the tide. The Americans listened to the sky, and the sky gave them warnings. Each intercepted message revealed the location of the next attack wave. Each decoded signal informed them when the Japanese planned to strike. In the midst of chaos, they held onto precision. In the midst of fanaticism, they held onto discipline, and their radar gave them eyes that pierced through cloud and darkness. Kamikazes depended on suddenness, on fear, on piercing through a defense unprepared. But an enemy forewarned is an enemy shielded. And as the weeks passed, the Japanese Ada